Almost 1 year ago, having been in Bali a few months, I was looking to buy a small villa, and I was introduced to a builder, and I asked him to come and see the villa that I was proposing to buy, which was only half built, in order for him to advise me on the building standard. As it happens, when we went to the site, he said he thought the villa was fine, but eventually, for another few reasons which I'll go into later, because they illustrate some of the pitfalls in buying here in Bali, I didn't buy. But on actually leaving the site, this particular builder said to me, "Have you thought of buying land and building yourself in Bali?" To which I said, "Yes, I have, but the idea terrifies me." And he said, "Well, let me put the feelers out for some land, and we can go and see it and discuss the options, and you can see how you feel." So, as you probably guessed, one thing led to another, and I did end up buying some land, and I did build on it, and that building is still going on and is in a much more advanced state than it was towards the end of that last year. So my intention is to do a series of short videos to really take you through that process if this is something that interests you and you want to know more perhaps about the process and the pitfalls of doing this. So a couple of pieces of advice I have which are very, very initial. And the first is that you need to know where you want to live. Now, yeah, you may think, well, I'll talk about stating the obvious, and it is obvious, but the point I'm making is that you, perhaps rather like me, might have felt, well, I know a particular area. In my case, I knew Legian and Seminyak, which are not to everyone's taste. But because I knew the area, I felt that this was an important factor and that I could make a judgment about living here. However, this might not suit you, and if you don't like busy places, and if particularly you don't like places where there's a lot of street selling going on, then you may prefer different locations in Bali, of which of course we know there are many. So for example, if you go to the other side of the island, to Sanur on the east coast, it's a very different environment to over here on the west coast. For a start, it's much quieter. It tends to be a bit cooler because it gets the prevailing wind from the ocean. And it has no surf because there is a coral reef just about 200 meters from the beach, which protects the beach from surf. And this can be very advantageous if you have a young family, for example, or you have no interest in surfing. So many areas of Bali, and we'll talk about some of those a bit later, but it's very important that you really don't, in the future, regret where you chose to build. That's the point. And you need to really research the areas in order to make that decision, even if that means, I would say, going and renting accommodation in order to go and live in that area for a few days and really explore. The other thing, which again is a real basic, is that you need to know what the land law and building law is in Indonesia and particularly in Bali. And it's not actually that complicated, but there are a couple of concepts that may be alien to, for example, Australians and Americans, which you kind of need to get your head around and decide if you're comfortable with. Now, the first thing to say is that foreigners cannot own land in perpetuity in Indonesia. The Indonesian constitution states this very clearly. But what you can do is one of three things, actually, but the most common thing to do is to buy what is called leasehold. Now, in the United Kingdom, we do actually have leasehold and had it for a long time, and it serves a different purpose in the UK to what it does in Indonesia. But basically what it is it's a very long-term rental, during which time you may not be evicted from the land by the landowner. That cannot happen unless you fail to pay something or other. But it is quite secure, provided that the paperwork is done properly in the first instance, something that we'll talk about a little bit down the line. So you need, in order to purchase land on leasehold, or on two of the other methods we'll discuss in a moment, you do need to instruct a lawyer, in my view. You cannot just rely on the notary to protect your interests. You need someone to oversee what's going on, who's independent of the notary. The two other methods of acquiring land is freehold, which you may not hold as a foreigner. You can hold a freehold vicariously through an Indonesian married partner, or what's called a nominee, which is someone you may or may not know that you tie into an agreement and they hold the land on your behalf. This latter method is fraught with some risk. I won't go into that now, but you can possibly imagine that things may go wrong with friendships and whatever, and you may be in a position going down that route and having difficulty recovering your title or the money for the land. The other way it can be done is through an Indonesian company, which you can set up as a foreigner, and you then undergo a commitment to investing in that company, and it requires you to acquire an investor's visa in order to do that. This is probably something you wouldn't want to do for just one private dwelling, but you might consider it if you are thinking about developing more than one villa over time. This could be quite a good route for you. And again, we'll go through these in detail in due course. I need to talk a bit more about leasehold, because it is very likely that this will be the way that you will buy land in Bali. Now, for foreigners coming into Bali or indeed Thailand for the first time, the length of leaseholds, this is where you effectively rent the land for a predetermined period, the lengths of rental can be surprisingly short. So, for instance, in the United Kingdom, leaseholds are typically in excess of 100 years. So, in other words, longer than a lifetime. But in Asia, leaseholds are typically around 30 years, maybe 40 years. And in Bali, actually, there are many leaseholds that are being sold for 25 years and 20 years. So, the ramifications of this are something that it's quite important for us to get our head around straight away. If you're going to buy land for, let's say, 25 years for X amount, let's say $200,000 total, just to pluck a figure out of the air, and your building cost is going to be another, let's say, for the sake of example, $200,000 US. Both figures are in US dollars that I'm quoting. Then if you're only going to own it for 25 years, and by the way, at the end of the leasehold period, unless you agree an extension to the leasehold with the actual probably Balinese landowner, certainly Indonesian landowner, unless you agree an extension, both the land and your villa go back to the landowner, him or herself. So in other words, your initial outlay is actually only for a limited period, and this can be very daunting for people when they initially consider a property purchase in Bali. Now, different people take a different view about this scenario. So some people, perhaps more able to face up to the future than me, go, well, I'm this age now, in 25 years, I think I may either not be living in Bali because I'm too infirm, or I will have passed into the other place. And therefore, I'm quite comfortable with buying a rental for 25 years, and I'm quite comfortable with the land and the villa going back to the landowner at that period. Other people, perhaps less sanguine about reality than as indeed I am, rather take the view that I would like to feel I was sitting on an asset. So in other words, that in 10 years' time, if my circumstances changed and I needed to leave Bali and go back to Europe, that I would be able to sell what I had built. And in my experience, quite a lot of people do have this mentality. And in that situation, you may think about buying a longer lease than 25 years. And it depends really entirely on your disposition, what you want to do. Not all leases can be extended. And it is the discretion of the landowner and what is actually written in the lease agreement. The lease agreement is merely a contract covering the purchase of land and the use of the land. And it is often written in what the terms of the extension of the lease might be, if at all. And landowners can refuse to extend the lease at the end of 25 years or whatever, but usually they agree to an extension because the extensions can bring in quite a bit of money for them without them really having to do any work at all. Also, it is the case in reality that clearly a building that has been on the land for 25 years, unless it has been maintained extremely well, will require a significant amount of maintenance and renovation, possibly demolition and rebuilding. And often the landowner does not want the expense of that, would just rather take the money for the extension. So in summary, the advantage of taking a longer leasehold rather than a shorter leasehold is that you're more likely to be able to sell a significant asset at the end of, say, 10 years. And that may give you a feeling of that you are making an investment rather than purely renting. So, for example, if you take out a 35-year lease and then leave Bali in 10 years' time and want to sell the villa rather than rent it out, which is something you could potentially also do, then it will be relatively easy to sell a 25-year lease. Conversely, if you acquired a 20-year lease and you leave Bali after 10 years, then selling a 10-year lease could be difficult unless you secure the agreement of the landowner that he will extend the lease for the new purchaser, and he or she may be very willing to do that, but you cannot foretell that necessarily at the point of purchase. Okay, that concludes this video, and in the next video I'll be talking about where to find land to buy and what you need to in order to do that, and more importantly even than that is where to find a builder, because finding a builder will be the most important factor in your build. Okay, thank you for listening and see you next time.